Roy Clark was a lot more than a country music legend. He was the smiling face of Hee Haw, the happy banjo virtuoso who brought life to each stage he played on. But after he passed away in 2018, something spooky showed up inside his Tulsa home. Roy had sealed a locked closet for decades, and the family found it while sorting through his possessions. Hidden away at the back of his private music room. There was no label, no key in sight, no explanation. But when they finally got it open, the room went quiet. What was inside wasn't just personalized, it was a shock. Letters to strangers, old military files, unreleased music, and a cryptic voice recording, only for when I'm gone. It was as if Roy had a secret life the world was never supposed to know about. And what they found in that closet would leave his family dumbstruck. To millions of Americans, Roy Clark was a familiar name. A smile that could light up any room. Fingers that played across strings like magic. Whether he was cracking jokes on Hee Haw or doing something heart-stopping, Roy was joy. Solos on the grand old Opry stage, but those nearest to him sensed something more was coming. A burden he carried through every show, unseen. Roy was born in 1933 in Maheron, Virginia, the son of a tobacco farmer and amateur musician. Life was tough, but Roy's love for music made the pain easier to bear. By the age of 14, he was mastering the guitar. By the time he was 17, he was national banjo champion. But there were times, even in his earliest days, where the spark would flicker, where he would retreat into himself. In an interview, he once said, "People think if you smile, you're happy, but some smiles are armor." The man America laughed with on Hee Haw was genius. Yes, but also eerie. With his career taking off, so too did the expectations. His schedule was brutal. Appearances, tours, TV shoots. The show must go on, even if he was under the weather or grieving. He rarely refused, but he didn't know how. Friends describe a Roy who gave all to the stage, but very little to himself, and the strain was mounting at home. He was warm, kind, but cautious. His house had rooms. Not even his children went in. Closets that stayed shut. When asked about them, Roy would chuckle, deflect, maybe tell a joke about secret stashes of banjos. But the joke was always a wall, a deflection. One closet in particular was striking. It had always been there, silent, unspoiled. "Never opened this," Roy told his wife of more than 60 years, Barbara. She thought it contained antique contracts or delicate instruments. That's all. But Roy had a way of wrapping his truths in song. His fingers would tell what his voice dared not. Hence the shock of his unreleased music, found later by the family. Roy was there, but not in the armor. And when the family opened that closet after his passing, they weren't just walking into a room. They were about to step into a hidden chapter of Roy's life. One written in silence, protected by guilt and buried under decades of public applause. Global thought they knew Roy Clark, but the man that no one ever really saw would be revealed in the contents of the closet. It was more than just a storage space. It was a vault, one corner of Roy Clark's music room. A narrow door, which most visitors never noticed, lay behind the amplifiers and the faded awards. Nobody could remember it being unlocked. Not a single time. His kids said it was always off limits. Even Barbara, his wife of 61 years, had never been inside. She'd ask him about it, and Roy would smile and say, "That's where the ghosts live." Then he'd move on, banjo strumming, energy shifting, hiding something. Roy died in 2018, and the family finally decided to unlock it. They went through the drawers and filing cabinets, the pockets of every jacket, until they found an old brass key hidden in a guitar case with red velvet lining. It fitted, and it was not a cluttered mess inside. It was intentional, organized, and it was saved. Sealed stacked cardboard boxes, labeled in Roy's handwriting. Black case, spools of magnetic tape, dozens of manila envelopes, many tied with string. The inside was as if no one had touched it for years. But then, behind the shelves, they saw something strange. On the back panel of the closet, there was a faint line, an outline. They pushed on it, and it gave with a soft creak, a hidden compartment. Inside, in a smaller box, locked. This one was keyless. They broke it open. There were unseen photos inside. Roy, next to an army plane. Roy shakes hands with a man in uniform. Roy, looking serious, in clothing from 30 years ago. These are not showbiz pictures. They were personal issues of government. And there was a sealed letter only for my family when I am gone. The hand was different, older, shaky hand. Inside was one cassette, marked Play Alone. The room fell silent. They didn't know whether to cry or to be afraid. The Roy Clark they knew, funny, generous, cheerful, suddenly felt like a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Ugh. But the closet hadn't just held memorabilia. It had a secret history, a disguised Roy, the man who bore his burdens in silence, the sort of man who concealed scars beneath jokes. And for the first time, his family was starting to understand how deep those scars went. The closet had patiently been waiting for decades. And now that it was opened, there was no going back. They waited until the house was clear. The family sat silently in Roy's music room, holding the cassette like it was glass. They found a tape player, one of Roy's old Realtor decks still plugged in under a dusty shelf. They put the cassette in, pressed play, and for a few seconds there was nothing. And then the static crackle. And finally a tired, aged, and unmistakable Roy Clark. "If you can hear this," he said, "then I'm already gone, and there's something I must say, something I never could when I lived." The room grew cold. It was not an action. That was an admission. Roy spoke slowly and carefully. He spoke about the cost of fame, friendships that vanished in silence, and a part of his life he had locked up, literally and emotionally. "Here's a name you've never heard of. Ellie," he said. "She helped me with things I couldn't tell anyone. When the lights went out and the crowd disappeared, Ellie was the only voice I trusted." He didn't say who she was. He just said she knew everything. Then Roy spoke of a tragedy in his past, a night that changed him forever. "I chose," he said, "and someone else paid the price for it." His voice broke. He hesitated. "Music was how I lived. No applause, no jokes, just music." 25 more minutes on the tape. He didn't cry. He didn't ask for forgiveness. But he said the closet was his way of remembering all the things the world didn't want to see. They only ever wanted the smiles. He said, "I gave them what they wanted. But inside I was a different person altogether." He ended the recording with a whispered sound. "Now you understand maybe why I kept that door. Close it was embarrassed. It was about living." The tape stopped. No one stirred. For a moment, it was as if Roy was still in the room, beside them, pulling back the curtain he'd spent a lifetime keeping shut. That tape wasn't for fans. Not for legacy, though. It was for truth, raw, vulnerable, undeniable, and it broke the image they thought they know. Roy Clark didn't just lock memories behind a door. He had interred a second self. And now with his voice ringing through the silence, that other self had finally awakened. Below the tapes and folders was a small wooden chest, unlatched but weather-beaten. Inside were dozens of letters in plastic sleeves, all carefully preserved. Some were scribbled on torn notebook paper, others on fine stationery. The name that kept coming up was Ellie. Just Ellie. No last name, no address. Some letters were for Roy. Others were clearly written by him and dated back as far as the 1960s. They were not love stories. Business. There was something else, intimate but cautious, like two people talking in a secret language. You were right not to tell them. The world wouldn't have understood and the stage would have never forgiven you. Ellie wrote in one letter, another reading, "Don't carry this alone. Not your fault. We did what we thought was right." The handwriting changed over the years, but the tone did not. Haunted, reflective, burdened. Roy's replies were full of regret and longing. "I've made a life out of laughter, but it still echoes inside," he wrote in one letter. "I still hear the tires. I still see his face." That sent a shiver through Barbara. She knew nothing about an accident. Who was he? And what did Roy mean by still hear the tires? They searched the closet again and found more. Behind the lining of a guitar case was a smaller envelope sealed with wax. Inside was a black and white photo of a teenage boy, with Roy's unmistakable writing on the back. "If only I had driven." Underneath, another letter from Ellie. "He looked up to you. He forgave you. Why can't you forgive yourself?" The picture, the letters, the cryptic references, it all pointed to a tragedy Roy had kept buried deep. A young life lost. A guilt never processed. Ellie, whoever she was, had been Roy's lifeline in the shadows. A A confidant he never introduced, never mentioned, but poured his soul into through ink and paper. These weren't fan letters. They were lifelines. And they revealed a Roy Clark who bled quietly behind the curtain of fame. The family realized they weren't just discovering secrets. They were inheriting grief. The kind of grief that had shaped the music, the performances, the man himself. Every laugh, every song, every show now carried a new weight. And as they read the final letter in the stack, dated just months before Roy's death, it ended with a single line. I hope they find this someday. Maybe then they'll. Who you really were. In the back of the closet was a black case locked, leather scuffed, brass latches stiff with age. Inside were reel-to-reel tapes, pristine, labeled only with cryptic titles like The Other Side, Wrong Stage, and one simply marked Midnight. These were not concert recordings or studio masters. They were raw, intimate sessions, just Roy, a guitar, and the kind of silence you only hear when a man is completely alone. The first tape began with the sound of a chair creaking, followed by a long exhale, then his voice, softer than anyone had ever heard it. He sang slow, painful, like the words were too heavy to carry. I played the fool on the screen. He whispered between verses, but the tears were always mine. The lyrics weren't clever or polished. They were confessions set to melody. One song detailed a lonely drive through Tennessee. Headlights slicing through rain. A crash never mentioned by name, but unmistakable in its imagery. Another song, Shadow in the Mirror, spoke of a man who couldn't look himself in the eye. Roy sang, "Every laugh I gave them stole a piece of me." These weren't for release. No overdubs, no harmonies, no banjo tricks, just voice and truth. The family sat in stunned silence as track after track unraveled decades of pain, regret, and longing. Even more shocking, some of the recordings were dated during years Roy had been at his public peak. Tours, awards, TV specials to the world. He was thriving. But in these tapes, he was falling apart. One song ended with him saying, "No one will hear this, but I had to get it out or I'd drown." The most haunting tape was the last one. Roy spoke straight into the microphone, not singing. "I kept these locked away because I didn't want to taint what people loved. They wanted the banjo, the smiles. But this is the man behind all that." Then silence. Not static, just nothing. The kind of nothing that fills a room louder than sound. These weren't outtakes. They were therapy, a mirror, into the parts of Roy Clark no one would ever see. And now, long after the applause had gone away, his family held in their hands the music he'd never wanted anyone to hear, but maybe needed someone to. Underneath the last row of boxes, tucked under a sheet of velvet cloth, was a military briefcase. It was worn, dented, cold to the touch. The family had no idea Roy Clark ever served in the military. It wasn't in any biography, not in interviews, not in liner notes. But inside that case was a story Roy had never told, not publicly anyway. The documents were stamped United States Air Force. His name, his ID number, a photograph of Roy, barely out of his 20s, standing next to a C-47 transport plane, guitar slung over one shoulder, a grim look on his face. There was a mission log, handwritten in Roy's neat script. Locations: Korea, Japan, Guam. The dates lined up with the early 1950s. What was Roy doing overseas during the Korean War? He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't listed as a soldier. He was assigned to a classified morale unit whose mission was to play music for the troop station close to active combat zones. But the more they dug, the weirder it got. There were several mission logs that were redacted. Others referred to transport flights that never showed up in official records. One entry read, "Dropped near base perimeter, played set under blackout conditions. Enemy fire audible from East Ridge." This was no entertainment. Roy had flown into dangerous, volatile situations. And in one chilling note, he wrote, "Music kept them alive one more night." That's what they told me. But I don't think I've ever come back from that place. Barbara hadn't heard a word about it. Not a memory, not a passing comment. He'd buried it so deep, she suspected even he tried to forget. There was a folded American flag among the files, and a list of names, handwritten, soldiers, fellow musicians. One name was circled, Ellis Raymond. Gone next to it. He shouldn't have been on that flight. A gut punch. Was this the man in the photograph from the letter earlier? Was this the man Roy had blamed himself for losing? It would explain everything. The guilt, the silence, the songs that spoke of crashes and shadows. Roy had carried not only the weight of fame, but the ghosts of a war no one knew he'd seen. These weren't just secrets. They were wounds invisible to the world, but now finally exposed. And they painted a portrait of Roy Clark, not as a legend, but as a man who had seen too much, lost too much, and somehow turned that pain into joy for millions, while never letting go of the darkness inside. At the bottom of the closet, behind the military case and tucked beneath layers of cloth, was one final envelope, yellowed, crumpled, sealed only with tape. It wasn't labeled like the others. No play me or read this when I'm gone. It simply said one word, forgive. Barbara held it in her hands for a long time before opening it. Inside was a newspaper clipping dated 1968. A two-car crash on a wet Tennessee road. One dead, one injured. The victim, Ellis Raymond, age 23, and U-Pan coming mandolin player from Nashville. The surviving driver was never named, but Roy's handwriting was scrolled in the margin. I should have been the one driving. Next to it, a folded note, faded, trembling words. We had just finished the set. He said he was too tired, but I insisted we drive home. I let him take the wheel because I thought I'd close my eyes for 5 minutes. I woke up in the hospital. He never woke. At all. Barbara's breath left her lungs. She'd never heard of Ellis Raymond. Never knew Roy had played with him. Never saw a photo. But the regret poured off the page as if it was written yesterday. Roy had never been charged. No foul play had been suspected. It was ruled an accident, but the guilt he had never escaped it. The letters to Ellie made more sense now. She must have been connected to Ellis. A sister, a fiancée, the silent recipient of Roy's lifelong confessions. In a letter Roy wrote, "Each time I hear an ovation, I see the crash. Every laugh a ring of what I stole. I lived, and he didn't live. And I still don't get why. The music, the military tours, the hidden songs, it all made sense now. Roy Clark had spent his life smiling for the world, mourning in private, bearing a death he felt responsible for, carrying the weight of survival. That night the family sat together in silence. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. It was like Roy was in the room with them again. Not the entertainer, the man, the one who cracked jokes to stop himself from breaking. The one who made the world happy and carried unspeakable sorrow. The one who never asked for forgiveness. But it was obviously so desperately needed. Inside that envelope, they found more than a story. It was the lost piece of his spirit. And it altered everything they thought they knew about Roy Clark. When the last box was unpacked and the last letter read, Roy Clark's family stood in a house unlike what they had ever known. The walls were identical, the furniture untouched. But the man they knew had changed for the world. Roy Clark was a legend, a country music superstar, the face of Hee Haw, a talented musician who could make a banjo sing and an audience roar with laughter. But off the stage, behind every joke, behind every standing ovation, was a man quietly unraveling. The closet was more than just storage. His sanctuary, his graveyard of memory, his secret confessional. Everything they found was a thread. And when they came together, they created a tapestry of truth that for decades had been woven behind locked doors. A secret military history that found him on the edges of combat zones where music was more than just entertainment, but a lifeline, a friendship, perhaps a brotherhood cut short by tragedy and a moment of sleep behind the wheel that haunted him until his last breath. A mysterious woman, Ellie, who turned into his mute partner in grief, a place for Roy to dump the pain he couldn't say out loud. And songs. Songs to rip your heart out. Ones never intended for radio or stage. Songs where Roy gave pieces of himself he couldn't show the public. Songs that bled. The family heard them differently now. And suddenly every strum, every lyric alive with meaning. His laugh was not only humor. It was a suit of armor. His charm was not just natural. It was living. And Hee Haw, for all its silliness, might have been the greatest performance ever. Because while the world laughed along, Roy was quietly keeping the ghost away. The truth didn't kill their love for him. It made it deeper. He was more than a star. He was a man who had survived war, tragedy, guilt, and the weight of silence crushing him. And yet he gave beauty to the world. And he gave him laughter. He gave him music. And that's what still makes his story miraculous. He might have fallen under it all. He might have vanished into his own grief. But he got up every day, grabbed his guitar, and decided to spread joy to other people. That kind of strength isn't created by talent. It's out of hurt, real suffering. Now that they found out what all was in that closet, Roy's family saw the whole man. Not the performer, not the icon, but the human who lived a lifetime smiling through the unspeakable weight. They left the door of the closet open, not as shrine, not as spectacle, but as symbol. Behind every great man, every showbiz legend, there may be a story no one ever sees, a burden no one ever suspects. And sometimes the real show is not on the stage. Was out of sight when the curtain drops. Roy Clark left behind more than a legacy of music. He left one last thing, a truth whispered and hidden in a closet, waiting for its moment to be heard. And now that it has, it changes.